non-physical, spooky stuff in which the thinking and the feeling and the choosing and all that inheres. The brain is amazingly complex. Sometimes it is said that it's a mere machine, but we know it's no mere machine, that it is, as sometimes Dan Dennett puts it, wonder tissue. The complexity is so extraordinary that we really can't fathom how you can get out of mere neurons, this wonderful arrangement of things that we do. The mind, what we think of as thinking and feeling and deciding and choosing, is really a function of patterns of activity in the physical brain. Now that's of course to say something very general, and what many people in neuroscience want to do is to understand what those networks precisely are like, what precisely are the mechanisms that allow us to do things like see in depth or make decisions. Additionally, although we are often sort of in a conventional sense inclined to think of ourselves as this I that stands aloof from or independent of the brain, the self is really a construct of the brain itself. We don't know exactly what kind of a construct, and we don't know how the brain does this amazing thing, which is within itself to make a distinction between this and that. Right? So it has a model of the external world, the world of nettles and fish and water and fire and all that, but it also has a model of the internal world. And somehow within the structure of the brain itself, that distinction is made. Self-representation is almost certainly multidimensional. It is probably more complex in primates than it is, for example, in turtles. But even fairly simple animals need to have a representation of their inner milieu, their temperature, their glucose levels, and so forth. They also need to have a representation of their body, where things are relative to other things. So we might, in a folk psychological frame of mind, think of ourselves as the puppeteer in there. But of course, that's kind of an illusion. So it's those sorts of things that I think motivate many students in the brain and behavioral sciences to say, look, there must be a different way that we need to think about these things. And part of what I want to do is explore those different ways and to think about the impact on the wider social world of what these changes mean. They didn't seem to me, actually, to be tremendously significant until, I guess it was perhaps last year, and it's part of the NeuroEnigma. No, it was the year before when Rick Ballou and I ran this series. And Herb York, who was the first chancellor of UCSD, gave a talk to CogSci 200. And because he had been involved both in the building of the bomb and in advising the president vis-a-vis dropping the bomb, and because he had been involved in negotiating disarmament treaties, he had a fascinating story to tell. And one of you said to him, so the issue of the bomb and its significance and what it meant to society to have the bomb and have it dropped, that was a huge issue for your time. What do you think is the issue for our time? And I thought he would say something within the political domain. And he said, I think the issue of free will and its impact, that is the scientific understanding of that and its impact on society, is the big issue. And quite honestly, I mean, he's not a philosopher, and I guess I should have thought that. But it really took me aback, and it provoked me to think about why he said that. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought that in his characteristically deep way, he was absolutely right. Now, part of what I suggested, at least with regard to the folk psychological story, is that we tend to think of our decisions as created within a sort of causal vacuum. And so we need to ask the question, can we have a conception of voluntary choice where we recognize that causality operates? So I'm going to give you a little bit of history, and then I'm going to go into some detail on what contemporary psychology has taught us about these things. David Hume in the 18th century, I think, gave the classic response to Descartes, who really did think that unless you had uncaused choice, you were essentially a puppet. And Hume made the observation, simple, clear, as many of his observations were, that in fact, of course, decisions must be caused by background, antecedent, desires, character traits, moods, temperaments. All of these things must be part of the causal background. But the kind of deeper point, in a way, that he made that really surprised people was that uncaused actions or uncaused choices would actually be, in a certain sense, random and kind of nuts. So suppose that, for example, all of a sudden, with no causal antecedents, I decide to sing Strawberry Fields. Right? And you say, well, why did you do that? I mean, you don't have a good voice. You don't typically do that. Nobody wanted to hear it. I said, you know, I just decided. You'd be worried, right? You would be worried. And I think it's a point that many quantum physicists who think that the solution to the problem of free will is going to be found in quantum mechanics have totally failed to understand. We can talk more about that too, but it is, I think, worth pondering that the kind of free will worth wanting, as Dan Dennett would say, is not the free will where, in a causal vacuum, I suddenly decide, I think I'll take off my shoe and throw it at Roger, right? Or sing Strawberry Fields or what have you. Doesn't make sense. It must come out of ourselves, our character, our hormonal milieu, our homeostatic measurements, and so forth. All right. But then, of course, Hume had to ask himself the question, so if it's all caused, and of course we do believe the brain to be a causal machine, what is the difference between behavior that we want to think of as voluntary and for which we want to hold people responsible, and behavior that isn't? And although it's not a terribly illuminating answer, it does kick off a research program. And what he says is, they have to be different kinds of causes. And quite reasonably enough, then, if I can put his idea in more contemporary language, what we want to know is what's causally different in the brain between me when I feel that it's time to wash my hands because I just cleaned a chicken, and an obsessive compulsive who must constantly wash her hands. There's got to be a difference. We want to know what that difference is. As part of sort of housekeeping here, I just kind of want to draw your attention to a couple of things. One is that if an event is unpredictable, and of course lots of what we do is not perfectly predictable, nothing follows about whether it was caused or not caused. Lots of unpredictable events are perfectly caused. Today's a windy day. I go up on the top of the building. I throw down a $5 bill. Its exact trajectory, millisecond by millisecond, is unpredictable because the wind is turbulent and blowing all over the place. Nobody would say, wow, you know, it's got free will. It's unpredictable, it must be uncaused. I mean, you might have thought that if you were, you know, a very primitive sort of Stone Age person, but you certainly, well, even they wouldn't have thought. So that's one point. The way physicists use the expression undetermined usually does mean not caused. All right? So the suggestion, if we think that the brain is a causal machine, what we mean is that it goes from state to state as a result of antecedent conditions. Had the antecedent conditions been different, this event would have been different. Okay, does anybody want to sort of plunge in at this point? 'Cause I'm still sort of laying out kind of background things. All right, so let's go back and look a little bit at the